Well, hello, everyone. Glad to see you're with us. We're continuing our study in 2 Corinthians. We'll be in chapter 7 today. We'll go through objectives, a summary, the outline, and some questions. So let's get started with the objectives in studying chapter 7. And that's to see how God can use others to comfort us. This is something that we probably could use more than we do. Is using others to help us in times of need. Another objective is to understand true repentance, what it leads to, and what the evidence is that it has actually occurred. So we'll go through the summary of chapter 7, and it begins with Paul summarizing his pleas to the Corinthians made in the previous chapter. And again, he calls for spiritual purity and for them to have their hearts wide open. Paul returns now to a point where he left off in chapter 2. His anxiety when searching for Titus. After arriving in Macedonia, he finds him, and the report Titus has from the church of Corinth is a source of great comfort and great joy for Paul. Indeed, even the manner in which Titus was received by the Corinthians filled Paul with joy. It was a blessing to him to see Titus so well received. And the Corinthians had received a previous letter from Paul with much sorrow. Remember that when we studied that one? But in the 1 Corinthians? But it was godly sorrow which led to true repentance. Paul could see that, and he wanted them to know it was only out of care for them he had written it. Remember, he struggled really hard about actually writing that, but this is something he knew he had to do. Thus, though the way they had received Titus and Paul's letter rendered quick obedience, gave Paul confidence in the Corinthians, and that they had understood what he had written and had accepted Titus as a blessing to the congregation. Okay, so here's the outline of the chapter. Starts out with Paul's plea to the Corinthians, and it is a plea for holiness. In view of the promises given, by cleansing themselves from all filthiness, and by perfecting holiness in the fear of God. This is the summary of the plea that was found in 2 Corinthians 6, 14 through 18. And then he has a plea for them to open their hearts. He pleads to open their hearts for Paul and his companions, for they have done no wrong to anyone, not said to condemn them, but out of love. This is a repetition of the plea that was found in 6, 11 through 13. Paul's comfort and joy. Next, Paul is comforted by the coming of Titus. Paul's boldness made possible his comfort and joy. And arriving in Macedonia, Paul was troubled, but God comforted him by the arrival of Titus. Okay, and next is the comfort by the hearing of their repentance. Titus bore good news of their repentance. This repentance made him glad he had written the earlier epistle, 1 Corinthians. Their repentance made him glad that he had written the earlier one, and the evidence of their godly sorrow from the things that Titus had told him. Even so, he initially wrote out a desire to express his care for them. See, when he wrote the first epistle, he did it out of a kind of a hesitation because he didn't want to discourage anybody, but he had to write it. And next is his joy in the joy of Titus. He was comforted by their comfort in their comfort. He also rejoiced seeing the joy of Titus. Titus's spirit had been refreshed by the Corinthians. The Corinthians had lived up the reputation Paul had given them. Titus grew in his love for them by the way they received him. Also, all this increased Paul's joy and confidence in the Corinthians. So this particular chapter focuses on the fact that after he wrote them a letter, asking them to deal with issues and situations that they had in the church. And they're changing and they're return to the foundations that Paul had placed there when he was with them in the church. And then Titus getting there and being received welcomely by Corinthians and seeing how well they were doing. And then when he tells Paul this, Paul just had tremendous joy. You know, this type of thing for us, when we try and help someone who is struggling or they're in error or whatever, when they change and become a better person, do you remember how pleasant or how actually joyful and how pleased you are that somebody has righted a wrong in their life and is now on a better plane? I know in my life there's been a lot of people that I've helped or tried to help, and when that help was taken and it improved their lives, I was very pleased with the fact that they were doing better and their life had a better outlook. And so this is the type of thing that you know, Paul was sincerely trying to help the people at Corinth, and from Titus's joy and Titus's report, he knew that what he had written had been effective. They'd taken it to heart. They truly thought about it, and they changed and become better Christians and more thorough Christians and more devout. Okay, so let's look at the questions for this chapter. We're going to start out with the main points, and one of them was Paul's plea, and the other one Paul's comfort and joy. So, in view of the promises in the preceding chapter, what two things does Paul admonish to us to do? And this was in the first verse, I believe, to cleanse ourselves from all filthiness and as flesh and spirit, and perfect the holiness in the fear of God. So, here's question number 3. What plea does Paul repeat that he has made in chapter 6? And we talked to this earlier when we were going through the outline, and that's to open your hearts to us. So that means receive them with sincere, earnest desire. What was Paul's condition when he first came to Macedonia? His flesh had no rest, and he was troubled on every side. And outside were conflicts, inside were fears. So he got to Macedonia with not a very good attitude. And then how did God comfort him in Macedonia? By the coming of Titus, by the consolation Titus had in the earnest desire, mourning, and zeal for the Corinthians toward Paul. So when Titus brought that report, that kind of just comforted Paul and put him at ease. Question number 6. What about the Corinthian sorrow that led to rejoice? Their sorrow led Paul to rejoice because their sorrow led to repentance. So this is the type of thing I just discussed about how when we try and help somebody and they accept that help and they become better, makes us happy and leads them to repentance. What's the difference between godly sorrow and sorrow of the world? And that's godly sorrow produces repentance to salvation. Sorrow of the world will produce death. Number 8, name 7 of the things that demonstrated that the Corinthians had godly sorrow. And this is from verse 11. And their diligence, the clearing of themselves, indignation, fear, vehement desire, zeal, and vindication. So this shows that they had changed and become really sincere in their attitude towards the godly sorrow, and they're leading to repentance and change. So why had Paul written to the Corinthians to begin with? This is chapter 12. That his care for them in the sight of God might be apparent. He wanted them to know that he truly cared about them. So, what gave Paul comfort and joy? The comfort of the Corinthians gave Paul comfort. And the joy of Titus, who had been refreshed by the Corinthians, gave him joy, seeing that what he was trying to do had been effective. So, number 11, what had served to increase Titus's affection for the Corinthians? And that was their obedience and how they received him in trembling. And the last question is, what else gave Paul joy? The confidence that he had in the Corinthians in all things. You know, it's really a joy when you find somebody that you know they're sincere and you have confidence in the way that they're doing things and confidence in the way that they're acting and they're going forward. Where you no longer, there's nothing worse than constantly worrying about, is somebody going to be okay? Is somebody going to be okay? Well, at this point, Paul had figured out that the Corinthians were on the right track. They were going to be okay. And that was really a joyous occasion for him. Well, that's chapter 7. I appreciate your attention. And I look forward to seeing you next week when we can go through chapter 8. Have a blessed evening. Good night.